The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the communications room at Naval Base Coronado. Sarah Mitchell sat hunched over her workbench, surrounded by circuit boards, wires, and the guts of what used to be a functioning tactical radio. Her small hands worked carefully with a soldering iron, the smell of melted metal filling her corner of the room. She had been working at the naval base for 8 months now. At 24 years old, Sarah was one of the youngest civilian contractors hired to maintain the communication systems. Most people assumed she got the job through connections, but the truth was simpler. She was just really good with electronics. While other kids in her neighborhood played video games, Sarah had been taking apart old computers and putting them back together in her garage. The radio on her bench was a different beast entirely. It had come back from a training exercise completely fried. Water damage, sand in the circuits, and what looked like impact damage from being dropped. 3 other technicians had already looked at it and declared it beyond repair. The Navy would have to order a replacement, which would take weeks and cost thousands of dollars. Sarah's supervisor, a gruff former Marine named Tom Rodriguez, had tossed it on her desk that morning with a shrug. "If you're bored, take a look, but don't waste too much time on it. That thing's toast." Now, 6 hours later, she was still at it. Her coffee had gone cold. Her lunch sat untouched in its paper bag. But Sarah could see the problem clearly now. The main processor board wasn't actually dead. It just looked that way because a tiny connector had corroded completely through. If she could bypass it with a jumper wire and reroute the signal through a secondary pathway, the whole thing might come back to life. Her coworkers had already left for the day. The base was quiet in that strange way military facilities get after regular hours. Not empty, but subdued. Sarah preferred it this way. Fewer distractions. No one looking over her shoulder asking when she'd be done. She carefully soldered the last connection, then sat back and stared at the radio. This was the moment of truth. Either it would work, or she'd just wasted an entire day chasing a theory. She connected the power supply and pressed the activation button. Nothing happened. Sarah's shoulders slumped. Maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe it really was beyond saving. She was about to disconnect everything when she noticed a tiny LED flickering weakly on the side panel. Wait, that shouldn't be happening unless there was power flowing to the secondary systems. She adjusted a dial and pressed the activation sequence again. This time, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the room, then cleared into the steady hum of an open channel. The display screen lit up, showing signal strength and frequency readings. Sarah couldn't help the grin that spread across her face. She'd actually done it. She was running through a quick diagnostic check when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots on linoleum. Military boots from the sound of it. The door to the communications room swung open, and Sarah glanced up, expecting to see the night security guard making his rounds. Instead, she found herself looking at a man in full tactical gear. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of weathered face that came from years spent in harsh conditions. His uniform bore the insignia of a Navy SEAL, and more importantly, the rank of captain. Behind him stood 3 more SEALs, similarly dressed, their faces serious. Sarah straightened in her chair, suddenly very aware that she was wearing jeans with a hole in the knee and a faded t-shirt. Not exactly regulation, but civilian contractors had more relaxed dress codes for after-hours work. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting down her tools. The captain stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the space before settling on her workbench. "You're the communications tech?" "One of them, yes, sir." Sarah wasn't military, but she'd learned quickly that calling officers "sir" just made everything go smoother on base. "We have a situation," he said, his voice level but urgent. "Our team's primary radio failed during mission prep. We're supposed to deploy in 90 minutes, and the backup units are already allocated to other teams. Someone said there was a tech still here who might be able to help." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. SEALs didn't just go on regular missions. If they were deploying on short notice, it was something important, possibly dangerous, and they needed communications equipment that would work perfectly under pressure. "I can take a look at it," she said, already clearing space on her workbench. "But I should tell you, I'm not certified for field tactical equipment. I mostly work on base systems and training gear. The captain pulled a radio from his tactical vest and placed it on her bench. Right now, you're all we've got. We can't wait for an official repair. Either you can fix it or we go in with compromised communications. Sarah picked up the radio and immediately recognized it as a top-of-the-line tactical unit. Much more sophisticated than the training radio she'd just repaired. This thing had encryption, multiple frequency bands, satellite uplink capability, and probably a dozen other features she'd only read about in manuals. She turned it over in her hands, looking for obvious damage. What happened to it? Training accident yesterday, one of the other SEALs answered. Got submerged in salt water longer than the waterproofing could handle. Sarah's heart sank. Salt water was a death sentence for electronics. It corroded everything it touched, and even if you cleaned it immediately, the damage often continued spreading over time. This radio had been wet yesterday, which meant it had already had more than 24 hours for that corrosion to work its way through the circuits. I'll need to open it up, she said, reaching for her toolkit. The captain nodded. Do what you need to do. Sarah carefully removed the outer casing, revealing the complex circuit boards inside. Her trained eye immediately spotted the problem areas. Green corrosion had formed around several key connections. The antenna port was completely oxidized. One of the power regulators showed signs of short-circuit damage. This was bad, worse than the training radio had been. She looked up at the four SEALs watching her with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. I'm going to be honest with you. This is pretty severe. Even if I can get it working, I can't guarantee how long it'll hold up under field conditions. But you can get it working? The captain asked. Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. Maybe. Probably. I'll need some time. How much time? Give me an hour. The captain checked his watch, then looked at his team. Some silent communication passed between them. We'll be in the briefing room down the hall. 1 hour. They filed out, leaving Sarah alone with the damaged radio and a ticking clock she could almost hear in her head. No pressure, she thought sarcastically. Just fix a piece of equipment that some of the Navy's most elite warriors are depending on for a real mission. No big deal. She took a deep breath and got to work. The first step was cleaning away all the corrosion she could see. Sarah used specialized brushes and chemical cleaners, working carefully to remove every trace of salt residue. Then came the delicate work of testing each circuit pathway to see what was still functional and what had been completely destroyed. 20 minutes in, she'd identified 3 separate breaks in the circuit board traces. The antenna port needed to be completely replaced, and the power regulator would need to be bypassed with a manual voltage control, which meant the radio would run through batteries faster than normal. She worked steadily, her focus absolute. Solder flowed, wires connected. Components were swapped out from spare parts she salvaged from other equipment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, even as her mind raced through potential failure points. At the 45-minute mark, she had the radio reassembled. It looked functional, but looking functional and being field-ready were 2 very different things. She connected it to her test equipment and ran through every diagnostic protocol she knew. Signal strength. Good. Frequency stability. Acceptable. Encryption handshake. Working. Satellite uplink. Establishing connection. Sarah watched the readings carefully, looking for any fluctuation that might indicate a weak point that could fail under stress. Everything checked out. She transmitted a test message to one of the base communications arrays and received a clear response. The radio was working. Against all odds, she'd actually pulled it off. But there was still the question of durability. In a climate-controlled lab, sure, it worked fine. But what about in the field? What if they ended up back in water? What if it took an impact? Sarah chewed her lip, running through everything she'd done, trying to think of any weak points she might have missed. The door opened again. The captain walked in alone this time. Time's up. What's the verdict? Sarah held up the radio. It works. All functions are operational. But I need to be clear about something. He waited, his expression unreadable. The repairs I made are solid, but they're not factory standard. I had to bypass some components and jury-rig others. It'll function normally under regular conditions, but I can't promise it'll hold up if it gets wet again or takes a hard impact. The antenna port especially is a weak point. The captain took the radio from her hands and examined it. He pressed the power button, and it activated immediately. He cycled through some settings, tested the encryption, checked the satellite connection. Everything responded exactly as it should. "This is good work," he said finally. "Really good work. You brought back a unit that 3 certified technicians said was dead." "Thank you, sir, but did you hear what I said about the limitations?" "I heard you." He met her eyes directly. "In our line of work, we're used to working with equipment that's less than perfect. What matters is whether it functions when we need it to. And right now, this is better than going in with nothing." Sarah nodded, though she still felt uneasy about sending them out with equipment she knew had vulnerabilities. "Is there anything else you need? Any other gear I should check?" "No. This was our only critical failure." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "What's your name?" "Sarah Mitchell." "Thank you, Ms. Mitchell. You might have just saved this mission before it even started." Then he was gone, and Sarah was left alone in the quiet communications room, staring at her workbench covered in tools and spare parts. She'd just helped prepare Navy SEALs for a real operation. The weight of that responsibility settled over her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She cleaned up her workspace slowly, organizing tools and filing away the spare parts she hadn't used. Her hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. When everything was back in order, she grabbed her cold coffee and her untouched lunch and headed for the exit. The night air was cool on her face as she walked to her car. The base was quiet, most personnel already home for the evening. Sarah sat in her driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, thinking about the captain and his team. Where were they going? What kind of mission required such urgent deployment? She'd never know, of course. That was classified information, far above her pay grade. But somewhere out there, probably soon, those men would be relying on the radio she'd repaired. The thought was both terrifying and strangely thrilling. Sarah started her car and drove home through the dark streets, unaware that this wouldn't be the last time she'd see the SEAL captain, and that their next meeting would change everything. 3 weeks passed before Sarah saw the SEAL captain again. In that time, she'd fallen back into her regular routine, repairing base communications equipment, running diagnostics on radio systems, and occasionally training new technicians on proper soldering techniques. The night she'd fixed the tactical radio had taken on an almost dreamlike quality in her memory. Had it really happened? Had she really helped prepare Navy SEALs for a mission? She had just finished replacing a faulty transmitter in one of the training building radios when Tom Rodriguez appeared at her workbench. Her supervisor looked different today. Less gruff, more formal. He was even standing up straighter than usual. "Mitchell, I need you to come with me to the command center," he said. Sarah blinked. "The command center? Why? Is something wrong with their systems?" "Just come with me. Bring your tools." This was unusual. Civilian contractors rarely went into the main command center. That was where real operations were coordinated, where classified information flowed constantly. Sarah grabbed her toolkit and followed Tom through the base's winding corridors. They passed through 2 security checkpoints, each requiring Tom to show his credentials and explain Sarah's presence. The guards waved them through, but not before giving Sarah curious looks. She was clearly out of place here in her work clothes and tool belt. The command center was exactly what Sarah had imagined. A large room filled with computer stations, massive screens showing maps and data feeds, and personnel moving with purposeful efficiency. The lighting was dimmer than in regular offices, making the glow from the screen seem brighter. Conversations happened in low, urgent tones. This was where important decisions were made. Tom led her to a side room, smaller but still impressive, with its own set of monitors and communication equipment. Several officers stood around a central table, examining what looked like mission reports. Sarah recognized the SEAL captain immediately. He stood among them, now dressed in regular Navy working uniform rather than tactical gear. When Tom and Sarah entered, the captain looked up. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been satisfaction. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, nodding to her. Thank you for coming. Sir. Sarah felt incredibly out of place surrounded by all these officers. She was acutely aware that she was probably the lowest-ranking person in the room, and she wasn't even military. One of the other officers, a commander based on his insignia, stepped forward. Ms. Mitchell, we understand you performed repairs on a tactical radio unit 3 weeks ago. Is that correct? Yes, sir. A water-damaged unit that was needed for urgent deployment. Can you describe the repairs you made? Sarah glanced at the captain, confused about why this mattered now. But she answered anyway, walking through the technical details of cleaning the corrosion, bypassing damaged components, and jerry-rigging the antenna port. The commander listened intently, occasionally glancing at a tablet he held. When Sarah finished, he exchanged a look with the captain. That matches the after-action report. Captain Morrison, would you like to explain? So that was his name. Captain Morrison. Sarah filed that information away as he stepped closer to her. The mission we deployed on was a hostage extraction, Morrison began. His voice was level, professional, but Sarah could hear the weight behind his words. High risk, time-sensitive. We had limited intelligence and zero margin for error. Communication with our command element was absolutely critical. Sarah's mouth went dry. Hostage extraction, real lives on the line, and they'd been depending on her repair work. Morrison continued. 40 minutes into the operation, we took enemy fire. During evasion, I fell into a drainage canal. The radio was submerged for approximately 15 seconds. He paused, letting that sink in. When I surfaced, the radio was still functioning. Not only that, it maintained encryption integrity and satellite lock for the remaining 3 hours of the mission. Your repairs held under the exact conditions you warned me about. Sarah felt her knees go weak. She'd sent them out with a radio she knew had vulnerabilities, and it had ended up in water anyway. If it had failed, if they'd lost communications during a hostage extraction? We successfully recovered both hostages, Morrison added, as if reading her thoughts. 0 casualties on our team. The mission was a complete success, in large part because our communications never failed. Not even for a second. The commander stepped forward again. Ms. Mitchell, what you accomplished that night was exceptional. You took equipment that certified technicians had written off as unsalvageable and made it field-ready in under an hour. More than that, your work held up under combat conditions. That's not just good technical skill. That's the kind of resourcefulness and dedication we value highly in the Navy. Sarah didn't know what to say. She'd just been doing her job, solving a problem the way she always did. I'm glad it worked out, sir. I'm glad everyone came home safely. Which brings us to why you're here today, the commander continued. He picked up a folder from the table and handed it to her. We'd like to offer you a position with Naval Special Warfare Command as a senior communications technician. You'd be working directly with SEAL teams, maintaining and repairing their specialized equipment. The pay grade is significantly higher than your current contract, and you'd have access to training and certification programs that would advance your career considerably. Sarah opened the folder with shaking hands. The offer letter inside detailed everything he'd mentioned and more. They wanted her to work with SEALs, with the teams that went on real missions, handled real crises, saved real lives. It was an incredible opportunity. There's one catch, Morrison added. The position requires a higher security clearance, which means a thorough background investigation. And some of the work you'd be doing would be classified. You couldn't talk about it with friends or family. Sarah looked up from the folder. When would I need to decide? Take a week, the commander said. Think it over, talk to your family if you need to. But we'd like to have you on board as soon as possible. Captain Morrison specifically requested you for his team. Morrison met her eyes when she looked at him. I trust you, Ms. Mitchell. You were honest about the limitations of your work. You delivered under pressure and your repairs saved lives. Those are exactly the qualities we need. The meeting wrapped up shortly after that. Tom walked Sarah back to her regular workspace, but this time he was grinning. You've been holding out on me, Mitchell. I had no idea you did work for Special Warfare. I didn't know it was that big a deal, Sarah admitted. I just fixed a radio. Yeah, well, apparently you fixed it really well. You're going to take the job, right? Sarah didn't answer immediately. The offer was amazing, there was no question about that. better pay, better opportunities, more interesting work. But it also meant more responsibility, more pressure, more situations where people's lives might depend on her work being perfect. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with the offer letter spread out in front of her. Her small apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. She'd moved to San Diego for this job 8 months ago, leaving behind her family in Oregon and the comfortable life she'd known. Her phone rang. It was her mother calling for their weekly chat. Sarah found herself explaining the whole situation: the midnight repair, the mission success, the job offer. Her mother listened quietly until Sarah finished. "Sweetheart, you've always been good at fixing things," her mother said finally. "Even when you were little, you couldn't stand to see something broken. You had to take it apart and figure it out. This sounds like they're giving you a chance to do that for people who really need it. But what if I mess up?" Sarah voiced the fear that had been gnawing at her since the meeting. "What if next time my repair doesn't hold? What if someone gets hurt because I missed something?" "That's a risk in any job that matters," her mother replied. "Doctors worry about missing symptoms. Engineers worry about structural failures, but they don't let that fear stop them from doing important work. They just get better, work harder, and do their absolute best every single time, which is exactly what you've always done." After they hung up, Sarah sat with those words for a long time. Her mother was right. Fear of failure was natural, but it couldn't be the thing that made her decisions. She thought about Captain Morrison and his team, about the hostages they'd rescued, about all the future missions that would happen whether she was part of them or not. She made her decision. The next morning, Sarah walked into Tom's office and told him she was accepting the special warfare position. He congratulated her, shook her hand, and admitted he'd known she would take it. "You're too good at what you do to play it safe forever," he said. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, background checks, and transitioning her current projects to other technicians. Sarah met with her new supervisor, a no-nonsense master chief who ran the special warfare communications shop with military precision. She toured the new facility where she'd be working, a secure building with equipment she'd only dreamed of using. On her first official day, Captain Morrison stopped by her new workspace. It was more sophisticated than her old bench, with better tools, multiple testing stations, and access to parts for equipment she'd never been cleared to work on before. "Settling in okay?" he asked. "Still getting used to it," Sarah admitted. "This is a lot different from base communications repair. You'll adapt. You've already proven you can handle pressure." He set a radio on her bench, this one looking pristine and new. "This is yours. Every technician assigned to the teams gets issued their own tactical radio. You're one of us now, Mitchell. When we deploy, you'll be able to communicate directly with us if needed." Sarah picked up the radio, surprised by the gesture. She was support staff, not an operator. She wouldn't be going on missions. But Morrison was right, this made her part of the team in a tangible way. "There's something else you should know," Morrison continued. "That night you fixed my radio? I had a choice. I could have scrubbed the mission, requested a delay until proper equipment arrived. But I read the situation report, and I knew those hostages didn't have time for us to wait. So I made a judgment call based on your assessment of the repair. You told me it would work but had limitations. I believed you, and I was right to believe you." Sarah felt the weight of his words. He'd trusted her technical judgment to make a tactical decision. That was a heavy responsibility. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand how much your work matters," Morrison said. "Every piece of equipment you repair, every system you maintain, every assessment you give us about what will or won't work in the field directly impacts mission success and operator safety. We're trusting you with our lives. But based on what I've seen, that trust is well placed." After he left, Sarah sat at her new workbench for a long moment, taking it all in. She'd gone from fixing training equipment to being an integral part of naval special warfare operations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Her first month in the new position flew by. Sarah learned the specialized equipment inside and out, memorizing the quirks and common failure points of gear designed for the harshest conditions. She worked alongside other technicians who'd been supporting the teams for years, soaking up their knowledge and experience. She also learned about the rhythm of the teams themselves. how they trained constantly, pushing themselves and their equipment to the breaking point, how they deployed with little notice, sometimes for days or weeks at a time, how they came back exhausted but always ready to analyze what went right and what could be improved. Sarah found herself working longer hours than ever before, but she didn't mind. Every radio she repaired, every system she maintained, she knew could end up in a situation like that first mission. Lives depending on the electronics working exactly as they should. It kept her sharp, kept her focused, kept her constantly learning and improving. 2 months into her new position, something happened that would test everything she'd learned. It started with an emergency call at 2 in the morning. Sarah was jolted awake by her phone buzzing insistently on her nightstand. The screen showed a number from the base. "Mitchell," she answered, her voice still thick with sleep. "This is operations. We need you on base immediately. Full recall of communications support. Something big is happening." Sarah was out of bed and pulling on clothes before the call even ended. Her heart pounded as she drove through empty streets toward the base. Full recall meant every communications technician was being called in. That only happened for major operations. When she arrived at the secure facility, it was organized chaos. Technicians rushed between workstations, officers huddled over maps and data feeds, and the air crackled with urgent energy. Sarah found her supervisor and asked where she was needed. "We've got multiple teams deploying simultaneously," he explained quickly. "Coordinated operation. Complex communications requirements. I need you on equipment prep. Team 5 is wheels up in 90 minutes, and 2 of their radios are showing intermittent satellite lock. Find the problem and fix it. Fast." Sarah sprinted to the equipment staging area. Team 5's gear was laid out on tables, already inspected and mostly packed. She grabbed the 2 radios in question and rushed back to her workstation. 90 minutes. She could do this. Except when she powered up the first radio, she couldn't reproduce the problem. Satellite lock established perfectly. All functions nominal. She tried different conditions, different settings, but everything worked flawlessly. 60 minutes left. Sarah forced herself to think systematically. Intermittent problems were the worst because they didn't show up consistently, but they always had a cause. She checked the antenna connections, the power supply, the environmental seals. Everything looked perfect. 45 minutes left. Then she noticed something. A tiny stress crack in the casing near the battery compartment. Barely visible, easily missed. She carefully opened the radio and examined the internal components near that area. There, so small she almost missed it, was a hairline fracture in one of the circuit board traces. It was making intermittent contact, which would explain why the problem came and went. Sarah's hands flew over her tools. Carefully expose the damaged trace, clean it, bridge it with a wire connection, seal it properly. Test. Perfect signal. She moved to the second radio and found a similar issue in a different location. Same fix. 20 minutes left. She ran both radios through every diagnostic protocol she had, pushing them harder than normal operational requirements would demand. Both performed flawlessly. She personally carried them back to the staging area, where team members were doing final gear checks. Captain Morrison was among them, and he noticed her approach. "Mitchell, those ready?" "Yes, sir." Both radios had hairline fractures and circuit traces causing intermittent issues. I've repaired and tested both. They're good to go. Morrison took the radios, checked them himself briefly, then nodded. "Good work. See you when we get back." Then they were gone, loading into vehicles that would take them to waiting aircraft. Sarah returned to her workstation, but there was no time to rest. Her supervisor immediately directed her to another task, then another. The night blurred into a continuous stream of equipment checks, repairs, and preparations. Dawn was breaking when Sarah finally had a moment to breathe. She stood outside the secure facility with a cup of terrible coffee, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, multiple teams were executing whatever operation required such massive coordination. And she'd played a small but crucial part in making sure they had the tools they needed. That's when Sarah realized she'd found exactly where she was meant to be. 6 months had passed since Sarah joined Naval Special Warfare Command. She'd found her rhythm, earned the respect of the teams she supported, and developed a reputation for solving problems others couldn't. Her workbench had become a place where operators brought their toughest challenges, trusting her to find solutions. It was a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Sarah was training a new technician on proper antenna repair techniques when her supervisor approached with an unusual request. "Mitchell, Admiral Hendricks wants to see you in his office. 15 minutes. Sarah's hands stilled on the equipment. Admiral Hendricks was the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. In 6 months, she'd never even been in the same building as him, let alone called to his office. Her mind raced through possibilities. Had she made a mistake? Violated some protocol she didn't know about? Did he say why? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. No. Just get yourself presentable and be there on time. Sarah quickly washed her hands, straightened her work clothes as best she could, and headed to the command building. The Admiral's office was on the 3rd floor behind a desk where his assistant sat guarding access. The assistant, a sharp-eyed lieutenant, checked Sarah's ID and made a phone call before gesturing to the door. "Go ahead in. The Admiral is expecting you." Sarah knocked once and entered. The office was larger than she'd imagined, with windows overlooking the base and walls covered in commendations, photographs, and military history. Admiral Hendricks stood behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Captain Morrison was there, along with 2 other officers Sarah didn't recognize. "Ms. Mitchell," the Admiral said, gesturing to a chair, "please sit. I understand this is probably intimidating, but you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite." Sarah sat, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Whatever this was about, it was clearly important. Admiral Hendricks remained standing, his presence commanding even though his voice was calm. "Captain Morrison has been singing your praises for months now. He tells me you're the best communications technician he's worked with in 15 years of service. That's high praise from a man who doesn't give compliments lightly." Sarah glanced at Morrison, who gave her a slight nod. "I've also been reviewing after-action reports from teams you've supported," the Admiral continued. "Equipment you've repaired or maintained has performed flawlessly in some extremely challenging conditions. Team commanders specifically mention the reliability of their communications gear in their reports, which is unusual. Normally, they only mention it when something fails." "Thank you, sir," Sarah managed. She still had no idea where this was going. One of the other officers stepped forward. He was older, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the field. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Commander Price. I run a specialized program within Naval Special Warfare. We handle situations that are particularly sensitive or complex. Our operations require absolutely reliable communications, often in environments where traditional solutions don't work." He paused, measuring his words carefully. "We're building a team of technical specialists who can deploy with our operators when missions require on-site communication support. People who can maintain, repair, and adapt equipment in real time under field conditions. Based on your record and Captain Morrison's recommendation, we'd like you to consider joining this program." Sarah blinked. Deploy? They wanted her to go on actual missions? "Sir, I'm not a soldier. I don't have combat training, or—" "You wouldn't be a combatant," Commander Price clarified. "You'd be a civilian specialist, like a translator or intelligence analyst. You'd undergo basic field training, physical conditioning, and tactical awareness courses, but your role would be strictly technical support. However, I won't minimize the risks. You'd be in potentially dangerous environments, sometimes under hostile conditions. This isn't a decision to make lightly." The room fell silent. Sarah's mind reeled with the implications. This wasn't just fixing equipment in a safe workshop anymore. This was real danger, real risk. But it was also the ultimate expression of what she'd been doing all along, taking care of the people who put their lives on the line. "Can I ask a question?" Sarah said finally. "Of course," Admiral Hendricks replied. "Why me specifically? There are technicians here with more experience, more certifications, more—" "Because you don't just fix equipment," Morrison interrupted. "You understand how operators think. When I brought you that water-damaged radio, you didn't just tell me the technical specifications of what was wrong. You told me honestly what would work and what might fail, in terms that helped me make a tactical decision. That's rare. Most technicians speak in technical jargon and get frustrated when we need simple yes or no answers under pressure. Commander Price nodded in agreement. We need someone who can adapt on the fly, who stays calm under pressure, and who operators trust absolutely. You've demonstrated all of those qualities. The technical skills can be enhanced with training, but those core attributes are what matter most. Sarah looked at each of them in turn. These were serious men making a serious offer. This wasn't some impulsive decision on their part. They'd evaluated her carefully and decided she was the right person for something that clearly mattered a great deal. How long do I have to decide? She asked. 2 weeks, Admiral Hendricks said. If you accept, you'd begin training immediately. The program is classified, so you couldn't discuss it even with other technicians on base. Your family would only know you'd taken a new position requiring travel. Are you willing to consider it? Sarah stood, her decision forming even as she spoke. Sir, I don't need 2 weeks. If you think I can do this, if the teams trust me enough to want me there, then yes, I'm in. A slight smile crossed Morrison's face. I told you she'd say yes immediately. Admiral Hendricks extended his hand. Welcome to the program, Ms. Mitchell. Commander Price will handle your transition and training schedule. And Sarah? Thank you. What you're agreeing to do matters more than you probably realize right now. The next 3 months were the most challenging of Sarah's life. She woke before dawn for physical training that left her muscles screaming. She learned basic tactical movement, how to operate in hostile territory, how to react under fire. She attended courses on field medicine, survival skills, and operational security. And through it all, she continued advancing her technical skills, learning to repair equipment with limited tools in austere environments. Her body adapted, growing stronger and more capable. Her mind sharpened, learning to process multiple streams of information simultaneously. She trained alongside other specialists, a translator, a medic, an intelligence analyst, all civilians preparing for the same kind of work. The physical training was brutal, but Sarah discovered reserves of determination she didn't know she possessed. When her legs wanted to quit during a 10-mile ruck march, she thought about the SEALs who did this as routine preparation. When her arms shook during weapons familiarization, she remembered that she was learning to protect herself, not to fight. Morrison checked on her progress periodically, sometimes showing up during training exercises to observe. Once, after a particularly grueling navigation exercise where Sarah had gotten temporarily lost, but figured out her location using terrain features and a compass, he pulled her aside. You know, when I first recommended you for this program, some people questioned whether a civilian could handle it, he said, especially one without prior military experience. You're proving them wrong. I'm just trying not to slow everyone down, Sarah admitted, wiping sweat from her face. You're doing more than that. Last week, during the equipment failure simulation, you repaired a radio using parts from 2 other broken units in under 20 minutes while moving through hostile terrain. The instructor said it was one of the best performances they'd seen. Sarah hadn't thought of it as anything special. It was just problem-solving under pressure, which was what she'd been doing her entire career. But she was beginning to understand that this combination of technical skill and grace under pressure was exactly what made her valuable to the program. Her first deployment came 3 months after she completed training. The mission brief was minimal. She'd be supporting a small team doing reconnaissance in a remote area where communications were unreliable. Her job was to maintain their satellite uplink and troubleshoot any issues that arose with their tactical radios. The night before they deployed, Sarah sat in her small apartment, double-checking her gear. Her specialized toolkit fit into a pack, designed to be carried for long distances. Inside were tools, spare parts, testing equipment, and diagnostic devices. Everything she might need to repair communications gear in the field. Her phone buzzed. A text from Morrison. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the easy part. It's the day after that gets interesting. Sarah smiled despite her nerves. In the months of working closely with Morrison and his team, she'd developed a deep respect for how they approached their work. They were serious professionals who planned meticulously, trained relentlessly, and still maintained a sense of humor about the job's inherent absurdity. The deployment itself was a revelation. Sarah experienced firsthand what it meant to operate in the field, the constant alertness, the physical discomfort, the way every decision carried weight. and she learned that her role was even more critical than she'd imagined. On the second day, one of the team's radios developed a fault in its encryption module. Without encrypted communications, they couldn't transmit their intelligence reports back to command. Sarah worked on the radio while the team maintained a defensive perimeter, her hands steady despite the knowledge that they were in a potentially hostile area. She traced the problem to a loose connection inside the encryption module, something that would have been impossible to fix without opening up the sealed unit. Except Sarah had learned a trick during her training, using a specific tool to access the module without breaking the tamper-evident seals. 20 minutes later, encrypted communications were restored. The team leader, a Lieutenant Commander Sarah had only met during pre-deployment briefing, gave her a nod of approval. "Outstanding work. Command is waiting for our report." That night, as they camped in a concealed position, Morrison sat down next to Sarah during her watch shift. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," Sarah admitted. "I thought I'd be terrified the whole time, but mostly I'm just focused on the work." "That's exactly how it should be. The day you stop being at least a little bit scared is the day you stop being careful." He looked out at the dark landscape. "You know, when I first met you, working on that radio in your workshop, I knew you were technically skilled, but I didn't know if you'd have what it takes for this kind of work. Now I do. You're exactly where you belong." They completed the mission successfully and returned to base 4 days later. Sarah was exhausted, dirty, and had lost 5 pounds from the physical exertion and field rations. She was also exhilarated. She'd done real work in real conditions, and she'd proven to herself that she could handle it. Her reputation grew with each deployment. Teams specifically requested her for missions where communications would be critical. She developed new techniques for field repairs, created workarounds for equipment failures, and became known as someone who could solve seemingly impossible technical problems with whatever resources were available. 1 year after joining the program, Sarah found herself in Admiral Hendrick's office again. This time, Captain Morrison stood beside her, both of them called in together. "I'll get straight to the point," the Admiral said. "We're planning an operation that's unprecedented in scope and complexity. Multiple teams, coordinated across vast distances, operating in an environment where traditional communications infrastructure doesn't exist. It's going to be the most challenging communications setup we've ever attempted." He pulled up a map on the screen behind his desk. Sarah studied it, immediately seeing the technical challenges. The terrain alone would make line-of-sight communications nearly impossible. Satellite coverage would be intermittent at best. And the teams would need to maintain perfect coordination for the operation to succeed. "We need someone to design the communications architecture for this mission," Admiral Hendricks continued. "Someone who understands both the technical requirements and the operational realities. Someone the team commanders trust absolutely. Captain Morrison recommended you." Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. This wasn't just fixing equipment or maintaining existing systems. They were asking her to design the entire communications framework for a major operation. "I'd need detailed intelligence on the operational environment," she said, her mind already racing through possibilities. "Terrain data, weather patterns, existing infrastructure if any. And I'd need to work directly with the team leaders to understand their specific requirements." "You'll have access to everything you need," the Admiral assured her. "And you'll have full authority to requisition any equipment or resources necessary. This mission cannot fail because of communications issues. That's your responsibility." Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She studied maps and satellite imagery, ran simulations of different communications architectures, tested equipment under conditions that mimicked what they'd face in the field. She met with team leaders, listening to their concerns and requirements, translating their tactical needs into technical solutions. She designed a hybrid system that used satellite communications for command and control, mesh network radios for team-to-team coordination, and backup systems for every critical link. She personally tested every piece of equipment, making modifications where necessary, ensuring redundancy for any possible failure point. The night before the teams deployed, Sarah conducted final communications checks. Every radio, every satellite terminal, every backup system, all had to be perfect. Morrison found her in the communications center at midnight, still running tests. Mitchell, you need to sleep. You can't do anything more tonight. Just one more check on the backup encryption keys, she protested. Morrison physically took the equipment from her hands. I've been on dozens of operations, and I've never seen anyone prepare as thoroughly as you have for this one. The systems are solid. Now go rest. We need you sharp tomorrow. Sarah reluctantly left the communications center and tried to sleep, but her mind kept running through contingency plans and failure scenarios. What if she'd missed something? What if her design had a flaw she hadn't anticipated? The operation launched at dawn. Sarah sat in the command center, monitoring communications across all teams. The architecture she'd designed worked flawlessly. Teams maintained perfect coordination despite being separated by hundreds of miles. When one team's primary satellite link degraded due to weather, their backup system activated automatically, exactly as Sarah had planned. 8 hours into the operation, disaster struck. One of the teams took enemy fire and had to make an emergency extraction. In the chaos, their primary radio was damaged. Sarah listened to the broken transmissions, her heart pounding as she tried to assess the damage from the symptoms she could hear. Command, this is Team 3. Primary radio is down. Switching to backup. But the backup radio signal was weak, barely readable. Sarah studied the signal strength indicators and location data. They were in a valley with poor satellite visibility, exactly the scenario she'd worried about. She grabbed a headset and keyed into the frequency. Team 3, this is Mitchell in command. I'm reading weak signal on your backup. Can you reposition to higher ground? Negative. We're pinned down. Need extraction but can't coordinate with air support on this signal quality. Sarah's mind raced. The backup radio wasn't powerful enough to punch through the terrain from their current position, but she'd built redundancy into the system for exactly this reason. Team 3, switch your backup radio to emergency broadcast mode and set it to relay through Team 2's position. They're on high ground with clear satellite visibility. There was a tense pause. Then, Command, Team 3, switching to relay mode now. Sarah monitored her screens as the signal routing changed. Team 3's backup radio connected to Team 2's communications system, which had the power and position to reach the satellite network. Suddenly, Team 3's transmissions came through clear and strong, relayed through their sister team's equipment. Command, Team 3, we have good comms. Requesting immediate air extraction, coordinates follow. Sarah coordinated with the Tactical Operations Center, ensuring the extraction helicopter had perfect communications with both teams. 20 minutes later, Team 3 was safely aboard the helicopter, wounded but alive. After the operation concluded successfully, Admiral Hendricks called Sarah back to his office. This time, the entire command staff was present, along with all the team leaders who'd participated in the mission. Ms. Mitchell, the Admiral began, thanks to your communications architecture and your real-time problem-solving, we just completed one of the most successful operations in naval special warfare history. 0 casualties, all objectives achieved, and perfect coordination throughout. The team commanders wanted to be here when I told you this. Morrison stepped forward, and to Sarah's shock, he came to attention and saluted her. One by one, every operator in the room did the same. Sarah stood frozen, overwhelmed. They were saluting her. These warriors, these heroes who risked everything, were showing her this respect. This isn't protocol, Morrison said, breaking into a rare smile. Civilians don't get saluted, but every person in this room knows that our safe return and mission success depended on your work, so protocol can wait. You've earned this. The Admiral spoke again, his voice formal. Sarah Mitchell, on behalf of Naval Special Warfare Command, I'm awarding you the highest civilian honor the Navy can bestow. But more than that, you've earned something that can't be awarded or worn on a uniform. You've earned the trust and respect of the teams. From this day forward, you're not just a contractor or a specialist, you're one of us. Sarah felt tears threatening but held them back. She managed to nod, unable to trust her voice. This moment, standing in a room full of warriors who'd accepted her as their own, was beyond anything she could have imagined that night a year ago when she'd fixed a broken radio. Later, after the ceremony and congratulations, Sarah found herself alone on the bench outside the command center. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant colors. She thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a girl taking apart computers in her garage to a woman who'd helped save lives through her technical skills and dedication. Morrison found her there, as she somehow knew he would. He sat down beside her without speaking for a long moment, just watching the sunset. "Thank you," Sarah said finally, "for believing in me when you had no reason to, for trusting me with that first broken radio." Morrison shook his head. "I didn't make you who you are, Mitchell. I just recognized it and gave you opportunities to show everyone else. You did the rest yourself." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Now you keep doing what you do best. You keep fixing things, solving impossible problems, and taking care of the teams. Because there will always be broken radios and impossible situations, and we need people like you to get us through them." Sarah smiled, thinking about all the challenges still ahead. The missions not yet planned, the equipment not yet broken, the problems not yet encountered. She was ready for all of it. "So," Morrison continued, standing and stretching, "there's this experimental communication system they want tested. Supposed to be impossible to repair in the field. Naturally, they asked me who should evaluate it." Sarah laughed, getting to her feet. "Let me guess. You volunteered me? Someone has to prove it's not actually impossible. Might as well be you." He started walking back toward the building, then paused and looked back at her. "You coming? That radio won't fix itself." Sarah followed him into the building, back to the work she loved, surrounded by people she'd come to see as family. She'd found her purpose in that quiet communications room a year ago, working on a broken radio that everyone else had given up on. Now she was living it every day, one repair at a time, one mission at a time, one life saved at a time. And somewhere in the world, another piece of equipment would break, another impossible problem would arise, and Sarah Mitchell would be ready to solve it. Because that's what she did. She fixed things. And in doing so, she'd found exactly where she belonged.